A bit of a shorter one today, based on the other stunties close to my heart. Halflings. These are for a Blood Bowl league that I'll be taking part in over the next few months. In particular, I'm focusing on how to paint those stripes that adorn so many a team's shirts. The same basic technique can, of course, be used for any subject that requires striped clothing, and it works as a good introduction, I'd suggest, to freehand painting, if that's something you find rather daunting, as I certainly did in the past. The first tip is to do with figure selection. It might seem obvious, but you'll find it much easier to practice on a model with a large, flat, unobstructed area of fabric than one featuring small pieces of material folded into various compound shapes, like the scarf around the ferret perching out of one of the halfling's trousers, or the sleeping cap on one of the catchers. Characterful though they are, you'll still sell the effect with prominent stripes on the main kit, contrasted with flat areas of a contrasting colour, should you so choose. So, for this demonstration, I've picked what in modern Blood Bowl is one of the hefties. Next, pick your colours, and decide in what order to paint them. Usual wisdom is to start light, and then paint the stripes in whatever's the darker colour of the two, to aid with coverage. But, since I almost always prefer undercoating in black, and have half the stripes in black, I've taken the lazy option. This works because Avalon Sunset goes on really well as a base coat, even over black. It's one of GW's finest paints in my opinion, and it turns what's usually regarded as a somewhat tricky colour to work with into something pretty trivial. I'm using a large-ish brush here to paint the initial lines onto the shirt, trying to keep the balance between uniform width on the stripes and following the curvature of his belly to account for any stretching of the fabric. Remember to do the same for the back. I'd recommend using the sides of the shirt, where the lines are concealed a bit by the character's arms, to fudge the spacing if you need to, so the lines can be arranged centrally on the front and back of the shirt. Now, this has covered the black undercoat fairly well so far, but remember Duncan's old adage about the two thin coats. So, when the first layer is dried, preferably while batch painting the other models to save time, it's on with the second coat, using a thinner brush this time to straighten up anywhere that your lines got a bit wibbly on the first pass. At this point I go ahead and finish the base coats for the rest of the model. It's a simple palette of things like Bugman's Glow for the flesh, Rakarth Flesh for the wrappings, Gorthor Brown for the leather, and Vallejo Metal Colour Steel for the metalwork. Only once those are done do I touch up the stripes, further neatening the lines and re-establishing the undercoat of black on the spaces left between the yellow. This is all done at this point to minimise the risk of painting over the same area several times, following each inevitable unintended splotch of paint. Next are washes. It's worth being really selective here. Don't just chuck the same wash over everything, but choose carefully for the colours you're choosing. I'm using Seraphim Sepia on the yellow to darken the stripes in those creases across the shirt and under the arms where it would be in shadow. You might see it looking a bit muddy at this point, having lost some of the definition of the lines we had earlier, but this is easily rectified with our mid-tone Avalon Sunset. I'm bringing that warm yellow back anywhere except for the dark recesses, and then applying a highlight with Aerial Yellow onto the edges of the sharp creases across the belly and around the collar and bottom of the shirt. This should be very familiar from how you'd usually paint highlights on a flat colour. The only difference is that I'm of course using two different palettes of dark, mid and high tones that simply abut each other along each stripe. So, after the yellow highlights I do the same for the black stripes, working from Eshin Grey up to Mechanica Standard Grey. If you can keep the crossover on those creases, between one edge highlight colour and the other, exactly in line with the edge of the stripe itself, then you've mastered it. For the rest of the model, everything's pretty straightforward. The only other slightly technical bits are for the skin and eyes, for which I've done a separate tutorial looking at a Dwarf Lord I painted for the Old World. Link in the corner of the screen now. The techniques shown there are pretty much identical to how I approach this model. And with that, everything's finished. To recap the main points, practice on models with large, flat, unobstructed areas first before moving to compound shapes. Choose the order you'll paint your stripes carefully, either to save time by incorporating your primer or base coat into the stripes themselves, or otherwise working from light to dark. Use a large brush to establish initial shapes before applying a second, or if necessary, third coat with a smaller brush to ensure good coverage and neaten up the edges. Do final touch-ups after you've base coated the rest of the mini. Apply washes selectively, and then highlight as normal, working from the mid-tone up to highlight, being careful to keep the crossover from one palette to the other exactly in line with the underlying stripes. Hopefully you found this useful. There's plenty of situations where stripes are fitting on models, and in more typical wargaming setting, it can be a nice technique to add a bit of character to units. Do like and subscribe if you found anything helpful. I know it's been a little while since I've shown any progress on the dwarves, but with how busy work's been recently, I needed a small side project to get back into painting before tackling the next block of troops. So with these out the way, I should be back to the original stunties soon. Good luck with all your hobbying, and until next time.